Let's talk unit coherency updates, engagement range, and wobbly model syndrome, with a look at some further 10th edition core rules leaks for Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about 10th edition 40k once more. Over the past 24 hours or so, it seems that the core rules have escaped to the internet, and it's been fun to take a look at some further clues as to what we're getting when they fully release. This video is a bit of an addendum to the previous one. Now we've got a few more pages and details, as well as the big primary leak that we've got. It seems that a few more pages have escaped confinement, some important things with definitions to core 40k things. There's one small but important update here, the rest is kinda similar, though still fairly interesting in the new context. This leak basically seems to be a different source to the really big drop of rules that we had the other day. That was all photos of the core book taken by someone in their car. It was missing a whole bunch of stuff though, things like a bunch of basic definitions like engagement range and coherency, which we now have, but also a bunch of other things that apparently are still to come, things like transport, aircraft, terrain and mission rules. I'm not sure if Games Workshop are going to let the cat out of the bag and just publish the entire thing early online. It's what they were going to do anyway. So at least at time of recording they haven't, so I thought we'd talk about some more stuff. This latest leak is a small one, just a couple more pages appearing. These ones are kind of definitions and clarifying things that go before the rest of the rules, it would seem. Again, it looks like these have been fairly well shared online, posted to at least 3 different Discord servers that I saw, though almost certainly a whole bunch of other places that I'm just too slow to track down. It looks like this one's from a different source, but is undoubtedly the core rulebook once more. The pictures on these are a lot more grainy, and weirdly overlaid with the watermark "Credit Your Artists" all over it. Not entirely sure of the specific point that they're trying to make, but I'm not against doing what a watermark tells me from time to time, so a big thank you to Skyfen and Let's Make It 40k for the channel art. Skyfen for making me this nice little Spets Tactics logo back when I was first starting out, and then Let's Make It 40k for designing that snazzy intro that you guys gave me so much positive feedback about compared with the first slightly low budget efforts. Artist credit all done, let's move on to the actual rules and talk engagement range, unit coherency, and wobbly model syndrome. First up, we've got unit coherency, probably the biggest news out of the leak here, as there has actually been a fairly major change that will affect really quite a lot of common units. Unit coherency in 10th does still seem to be fairly similar to 9th. As per normal, your models have to remain in coherency distance 2 inch horizontally or 5 inch vertically, and the models have got to be chained together and not in clumps like the diagrams on the right. 9th edition brought in a sort of 2-level system to this, where if you had a bigger sized squad they had to be a bit more clumped up together, and it meant that each of your models had to be in coherency distance of 2 different models in your unit and not just one. This was to disincentivize things like conga lines, where you just spread out all the units to absolutely maximal coherency and blocked an entire board or something, or do other weird things like chaining out to objectives or back to characters for aura buffs. It's definitely a lot harder to chain like this if you have to be in range of 2 different miniatures within the unit. If you do spread out to maximal distance, then the instant you start losing casualties, the squad might kind of implode. The change to the rules, though, is the number of miniatures that you need in the squad to trigger this, and basically Games Workshop have decided to make their rules one model more lenient, so now you still get the super easy coherency even when your squad's up to 6 models rather than just 5. And that does give 6 model units a much better advantage in terms of positioning and where they can move themselves on the board without worrying too much about losing models. I think it's a kind of interesting change and not really one that I expected, but I definitely can see the logic of it. In 9th edition, 5 model units were basically all the rage. They were just small enough to not trigger the blast keyword at all, and also they didn't give you the issues with coherency that 6 model units would. It was maybe just a bit awkward for really quite a lot of units that Games Workshop sells. They often have boxes that come in sets of 3, like say Blade Guard Veterans or Aggressors or World Eaters 8-bound and things, and it often meant that in terms of optimal tactics and things, the best way to field your 6-man units was often just to drop a model and save the points, and field your unit in a squad of 5 where it wasn't going to be super vulnerable to blasts or give you positioning issues. Now Games Workshop has basically changed both of those rules. 5-man units will be susceptible to blast now, blast weapons will gain 1 extra attack against them, and now 6 model units aren't quite as punishing. I think in reality that's going to mean that quite a lot of people with these up to 6 model units will actually field them in 6s rather than 5s. Probably a good decision overall for the practicalities of people actually assembling and collecting models. Looks like now the breakpoint is going to be 7 miniatures, so it seems that Nurgle's number is going to be the breakpoint there. Kind of funny that just about the only kit that comes in 7s is the Plague Marine kit, just after we got the Death Guard preview that a lot of people were underwhelmed by the other day. Might be one of the only kits where Games Workshop now incentivise you to not field quite all of the models and just drop you down to a 6 from 7. Otherwise though, certainly not the most major changes in the world. You still can't move out of coherency voluntarily, If you're not able to finish a move in Coherency, then the unit can't move, and it does look like they've still retained the rule where it's really very punishing if you do break unit Coherency. This is now checked at the end of the turn, seeing as the morale phase has gone away, and basically if your unit isn't in Coherency, then the controlling player has to remove models one by one until the unit resumes it. I guess this is the ultimate incentive to keep your unit together and not have them break Coherency, but I feel like if you play against an opponent that enforces this to the absolute letter of the rule, it could be a bit of a gotcha moment to newer players. It means that earlier in the turn, if you just removed a casualty a little bit carelessly and hadn't realised that you'd broken Coherency, then you could get punished very, very hard with random slain models for it. I think that most people tend to play when it's easily avoidable. They're just happy for you to rejig things a bit and not take needless casualties if it didn't make sense, but still feels like an area where you need to take some massive care of if you're playing some massively cutthroat competitive games. Overall though, I do quite like the coherency change, seems like a broadly positive step for quite a lot of units in the game. Otherwise, the other confirmations are mainly things that are broadly the same as before. We didn't have a formal definition for engagement range on the previous league, and it does seem that it's still going to be the 1 inch horizontally and 5 inch vertically. Still makes sense. I feel like that was a good system for being able to engage units in ruins and things and not making them invulnerable to combat. I think it's still going to have a very different feel to 10th edition. When you're actually charging into combat, you have to try and make base contact if you can now. No just nosing into engagement range and then using pile-ins to jump around the enemy units. And then for actually fighting in combat, it's now the base-to-base fighting, so you've got to base your enemy and then have one of your other models in base contact with your model. So you can still fight in 2 ranks, but you have to be absolutely jam-packing them up into combat. In the last video I mentioned big guns never tire, which I still might do a video on, but I followed that up with a channel poll to ask you guys your interpretation of the rule and whether or not tanks and vehicles are indeed able to fire out of engagement range now. It seems that the majority take on that is very much that you can at the moment. I listed the rules plain text alongside the poll. So it seems that if you have tanks and vehicles in combat, most people believe that you should be able to fire out of combat now, albeit taking the -1 to hit penalty on anything that isn't a pistol. The actual breakdown of the vote was 71% yes, 12% no, and 16% saying it was genuinely unclear and needed an FAQ. Definitely not one of Games Workshop's most clearly written rules, but I do personally agree with the majority take there. It does seem to check out rules are written in my opinion. Though I must admit the fact that I've seen at least a fair few people debate it, and a lot of people have voted that it's unclear on the poll, does imply that Games Workshop should probably follow it up with an FAQ at some stage, just so everyone's on the same page and no one's feeling hard done by. Finally, in the leaked definitions and things, they've got their new version of Wobbly model syndrome, something that often seems to manifest itself in the first few pages of Warhammer 40k rules. It's had a few different interpretations and slight changes in wording over the years. This one is kind of borderline whether or not it's a rule or a bit of a guideline really. This one is listed as hints and tips in the rules section. In general, it's just their idea that if you've got a model that can be legally placed on one place of the board, but it looks like it's in a very precarious place that could fall over and smash easily, in general, it's a good idea to just say, yes, we know where the model is, you can put that down somewhere a bit more stable, and then we can just hold it back in position if we need to measure ranges or line of sight or anything. I feel like the vast majority of the time it's something that doesn't really cause too much confusion, and I think most people would only use it when it's intended. I feel like it does depend on the terrain rules being at least somewhat tight though, and being quite clear as to whether or not you can place certain miniatures in places. I believe sometime in 8th edition there was times where you could sort of legally place a repulsed executioner on the top floor of a ruin if it could balance, and then if you did want to cheese the rules a bit you could just claim Wobbly model syndrome to basically remove it to somewhere of safety and count that you've got the weird tactical advantageous position. I'd guess that this isn't really what they'd intend, though I kind of feel like the place that they really need to clarify this is in the terrain rules, as that should really be the bit that specifies which positions you're allowed to put models in, and whether or not you can have tanks balancing on steeples and things, which I think most reasonable people wouldn't try to do. This version doesn't really seem too much changed from the previous. It's listed as hints and tips, so maybe isn't 100% enshrined in core rules or anything like that, and it does have the rider on it saying that provided both players agree and know its actual location. So it does sound like it's a rule that you can only invoke with your opponent's permission in the first place. Hopefully the terrain rules will be fairly clear on it though. In any case, a few helpful clarifications there, nothing really too groundbreaking. Most of these do remain really quite similar from 9th edition, so I guess Games Workshop are quite happy with them. I feel like the coherency change is probably going to be a good thing. That should impact really quite a lot of units, and you might get people actually using their full set of 6 kits a bit more than they were before, now that the jump from 5 to 6 no longer impacts either blast or coherency. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which you can find linked in the video description below. As well as supporting all the content coming, channel patrons do get a few other advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.